There are betrayals that break your heart, and then there are betrayals that happen while your heart is literally breaking. Geoffrey Ashton was 72 years old, alone in a country he had come to love, when the chest pain came for him in the middle of a Tuesday morning. He survived. What he didn't survive, not cleanly, not completely, was what happened to his bank accounts while he was unconscious, then sedated, then too weak to think about anything except the next breath. The woman he trusted with his recovery was not who she said she was. The $485,000 she took while he lay in that hospital bed wasn't just money. It was everything he thought he understood about care, about closeness, and about what it means to let another person see you when you have nothing left to hide behind. This is his story. The morning it happened, I was making coffee. That's the part that still catches me when I think about it. Not some dramatic moment. Not a warning I ignored. I was standing at the counter in my apartment in Quezon City, spooning grounds into the filter the way I had every morning for 2 years. And then there was a pressure in my chest that didn't feel like pressure so much as it felt like someone had placed both hands flat against my sternum and was slowly, steadily, pushing inward. My left arm went strange. Not numb exactly, more like the feeling of a word you know but cannot quite retrieve, a heaviness that didn't belong there. My legs went soft underneath me. I had enough time to reach for the counter, and then the floor came up to meet me, and then there was nothing at all. I don't know how long I was down. The building's daytime security guard, a young man named Rowley who greeted me every morning with a cheerful wave from his desk on the ground floor, told me later that I must have knocked the coffee maker off the counter when I fell because the sound carried into the hallway. My neighbor across the hall, a woman named Mrs. Pacampra, who was 65 years old and kept precise hours, heard the noise and came to investigate. She found my door unlocked. I hadn't latched it properly after my evening walk the night before, and she pushed it open and found me on the kitchen floor. She called for help immediately. The ambulance came. I was taken to the hospital. I owe Mrs. Pacampara everything. I have told her this. She waves it off the way generous people always wave off the enormous things they've done. But if she hadn't heard that coffee maker, and if that door hadn't been ajar, I am not certain anyone would have found me in time. I think about that sometimes on quiet mornings. I came around in the hospital, bright ceiling, that particular institutional smell that is the same in every country, antiseptic and recycled air, something attached to my left hand, a monitor beeping with patient, indifferent regularity beside the bed. There was a woman in blue scrubs standing at the side of my bed writing something on a clipboard. She looked up when she saw my eyes open. "Mr. Ashton," she said. Her voice was calm and measured. "Welcome back. Try not to move. You're going to be all right." Her name, she told me when I asked, was Melissa Navarro. I need to tell you about the man I was before that morning, because if you don't understand who I was, none of what came after makes complete sense. My name is Geoffrey Ashton. I am 72 years old. I am from Boston, Massachusetts. I spent 35 years as an executive director of operations for a mid-sized logistics company, the kind of career that sounds dry when you describe it at parties, but that I found genuinely satisfying for most of its duration. I was good at managing systems. I understood how to make large, complicated things run smoothly, how to identify friction points before they became failures, how to read a process and locate where it was likely to break. That skill set served me well professionally. In the rest of my life, it was less useful. My marriage to Carol ended 11 years before I went to the Philippines. Not with drama, not with specific cruelty, just with the slow, mutual recognition that we had become two people maintaining a structure whose original purpose had quietly expired. We were both careful and both tired, and neither of us was willing to do what it would have taken to rebuild what we'd let go. We divorced with a certain amount of dignity and a certain amount of sadness and went our separate ways. Our son, Patrick, who lived in Portland with his wife and their 2 children, had navigated the divorce with the careful, watchful competence of a child who learned early to manage difficult situations without making them worse. He and I spoke regularly, but not deeply. We had let a distance develop between us that neither of us had chosen on any single day, but that had accumulated across years of being busy and fine and not quite close enough to say so. I retired at 69. The company gave me the appropriate send-off, the framed photograph, the speeches. My retirement package was solid. My savings were healthy. I moved into a smaller apartment in Boston and discovered that a life emptied of 35 years of professional obligation was a great deal quieter than I had anticipated, and not always in the restful way I had imagined. Boston in January. With a calendar that echoed and a thermostat I kept adjusting and too many evenings watching news I had no power over, was not what I had envisioned retirement to feel like. I went to the Philippines because my former colleague Ben Hartley had been sending me photographs of it for a year and a half. Ben had retired 2 years before me and had built a complete life in Cebu, a comfortable apartment, a daily routine, a social circle of expats and locals who had absorbed him into something that looked, from the photographs, genuinely alive. He sent me pictures of sunsets over the water, meals that cost $3 and tasted extraordinary, groups of people laughing at outdoor tables in January while Boston was gray and frozen. After 6 months of the quiet I had thought I wanted but wasn't actually enjoying, I booked a flight. I intended to visit for 1 month. I stayed for 2 years before the heart attack, and I would have stayed longer. I found in Quezon City a pace of daily life that suited me in ways I hadn't known to look for. The city was loud and warm and full of human activity, and I discovered that I needed that proximity to other people more than my carefully managed Boston life had ever required me to admit. I walked every morning. I ate at local restaurants where I'd become a familiar, nodded-at face. I found an English-language book group that met Wednesday evenings in a coffee shop near my apartment. I was not lonely the way I had been in Boston. Something had quietly unlocked in me. I was not looking for a relationship. I want to say this plainly because it matters. I was not on any apps, not attending events with that purpose, not telling myself a story about finding love in a foreign city. What I had in Quezon City was peace and a routine and a growing sense that there was still texture to my days, and I valued all of that enough to leave it alone. Which is why meeting Melissa the way I did, flat on my back in a hospital ward, afraid, dependent on strangers for the most basic things, meant that none of the usual caution applied. There is no armor when you have just had a heart attack. You are simply a person, stripped back to the essential fact of your own continued existence, and whoever stands beside you with a calm voice and a kind face becomes, in that particular nakedness, enormously important. She was patient and clear in the way the best medical people are. She explained what had happened to me, a significant myocardial infarction, serious but manageable with proper medication and recovery. She explained each procedure before it happened, each medication before it was administered, each number on the monitor, and what it meant. She never spoke down to me. She never used the tone that some medical staff use with elderly patients, the tone that quietly implies helplessness. She spoke to me like a man who was temporarily incapacitated and would, with the right care, be himself again. She asked if I had family to notify. I gave her Patrick's number. My hands weren't steady enough to manage the phone, so she made the call herself, and I heard her explain the situation to him in measured, clear terms that struck the right balance between honest and reassuring. She gave him the name of the cardiologist in the hospital's international contact line. She told him his father was going to be all right. She said it with enough certainty that I believed it too, which was something I genuinely needed in that moment. Patrick flew in 4 days after the heart attack. He stayed for 10 days, which surprised me. Our relationship in recent years had run on scheduled efficiency rather than extended presence, and 10 days felt like an act of something more than obligation. We talked in the hospital room in ways we hadn't talked in years, about his mother, about the distance that had grown between us, and how neither of us had specifically chosen it, about what I was doing here alone and whether I was actually all right. Some of it was uncomfortable. All of it was overdue. Melissa was present through most of those 10 days. Not intrusively, she had her other patients, her rounds, but she checked on me with a frequency and personal attention that stood out. She remembered details I had mentioned in passing. She brought me a specific brand of biscuits from the hospital canteen after I said offhandedly that the standard crackers reminded me of a type from a shop near my apartment. She remembered that I took my tea without sugar after I had mentioned it once. She asked me questions about Patrick when he wasn't in the room, what he did for work, what his children were like, and when he was there. She greeted him with the warmth of someone who already knew something important about him. Patrick noticed. On his second to last day, while Melissa was doing rounds, he stood at the window of my hospital room and said, without quite looking at me, "She pays a lot of attention to you." "She's a good nurse," I said. "It's more than that. She remembers everything." "Patrick, I'm just noting it, Dad. That's all." He smiled the way he does when he has decided not to push further, and I let the moment pass. He flew back to Portland 2 days later, and I told him I was fine, and I believed it. He looked back at me before going through the security line at the airport. I had insisted on coming to see him off, which my cardiologist had cautiously permitted, and he had the expression of a man who is still thinking about something he has decided not to say. I was discharged after 17 days. The cardiology team gave me detailed written instructions, 4 medications, dietary restrictions, a graduated return to activity, follow-up appointments at 2 weeks, 6 weeks, and 3 months. The prognosis was good if I was careful. They used the words low stress with an emphasis that indicated they meant them literally. 3 days after discharge, Melissa appeared at my apartment door. She said she was checking in on me. She said the hospital encouraged home visits for post-cardiac patients, without immediate family nearby, that some of the nursing staff did this informally, as an extension of care. She had a small bag. She took my blood pressure, reviewed the medication schedule I had been maintaining, asked about my sleep and my appetite and whether I had been walking as the doctors recommended. She stayed 45 minutes, made tea, and was completely professional throughout. She came back 4 days later, then 3 days after that, then twice in 1 week. By the 4th visit, I had stopped thinking of it as medical follow-up. I had started thinking of it as the most consistent human company I had had in months, possibly years, and I was grateful for it in a way that I did not examine carefully, because examining it would have required acknowledging how much I had needed it. She was 38 years old. She had grown up in Quezon City, trained as a nurse, worked at the hospital for 6 years. She had a younger sister named Gemma, whom she helped support financially. She mentioned this once, only when I asked about her family, and she mentioned it without weight or implication, the way you mention something that is simply true about your life. She had a way of sitting with silence comfortably that I had rarely found in other people. We could sit on the balcony after dinner and say nothing for 10 minutes, and it felt like company rather than absence. Over the weeks that followed, the visits became something other than what they had been. Not medical, just 2 people who had gotten used to each other's presence and had stopped needing a clinical rationale for it. She brought food sometimes, something she had cooked or picked up from a market on her way. We ate and talked about a wide range of things. She asked me about Boston, about my career, about the years when Patrick was young and I was still figuring out how to be a father alongside everything else I was trying to be. She was interested in the specific details of a life that was very different from her own, and I found myself telling her things I had not told anyone in a long time, things about Carol, about the loneliness that had followed the divorce and that I had managed by working harder rather than by feeling it, about the particular quality of quiet in my Boston apartment in winter that I had thought was peace, and that turned out, when I finally had enough distance to see it, to have been something closer to numbness. She listened. She did not rush to reassure or redirect. She asked follow-up questions that showed she had heard the previous answer. It had been a very long time since anyone had listened to me like that. 2 months after discharge, on a Saturday morning, we were sitting on my small balcony with coffee and the city moving below us in its ordinary, complicated way. She turned to look at me and said, "Geoffrey, I think about you when I'm not here. I don't know exactly what to do with that, but I wanted you to know." She said it simply. No fanfare, no theater, just the statement, offered without demand. I sat with it for a moment. I thought about all the sensible reasons to be careful, the age difference, the context in which we had met, the various cautions that a man of 72 in a foreign country probably owed himself. I thought about all of that, and then I told her that I thought about her too. My friend Ben drove up from Cebu in September to check on me. He was the first person from my real life who met Melissa, and I paid attention to his face when she joined us for dinner. He was warm and easy and asked her good questions and laughed at the right moments. But later, when she had gone home and Ben and I were sitting with whiskey and the city going quieter around us, he set his glass down and looked at me directly. "How much do you actually know about her?" he said. "I've spent 3 months with her, several times a week." "That's not what I asked. I asked what you know, where she actually lives, who else in her life you've met, whether you've verified anything about her." "I'm not going to investigate her like a criminal suspect, Ben. I know you're not. But Jeff, you had a heart attack. You were in a hospital bed and you were alone, and she appeared, and she has been very attentive ever since. I'm not saying anything definite. I'm saying the information you have about her is thin, and the trust you're placing in her is not thin." I heard him. The reasonable part of me heard him completely. But the part of me that had sat on that balcony 2 months earlier and felt, for the first time in years, like something was genuinely possible, that part didn't want him to be right. I thanked him for his concern and changed the subject, and he let me, though not without a look that said he hadn't been convinced by the change of subject. He left the next morning. I pushed the conversation to a corner of my mind and set something heavy in front of it and tried not to think about what the wait was for. The first moment of real discomfort came in October. I had given Melissa a key to my apartment. It had happened gradually. She had offered to check on things when I was at my follow-up appointments, to air out the rooms, to pick up items I needed from the pharmacy or the market. It was practical, and I had thought about it and decided it made sense. The key was in that category, a practical extension of a close relationship, not a significant act of trust in isolation. One evening, I came home from my 6-week cardiac follow-up to find her in my small study, at the desk where I kept my laptop and my financial folders. She was standing rather than sitting. She had heard me come in and was moving toward the hallway before I reached the study door. She smiled easily and said she had been looking for a pen because she had been adding to the grocery list she kept for me. The pen holder had been on the kitchen counter since the first day I moved into the apartment. She had used it herself on previous visits. She showed me the list. The items were real milk, bread, the crackers I liked, some vegetables I had mentioned running low on. There was nothing I could specifically challenge. But the image stayed with me afterward. Melissa standing at my desk, in front of my closed laptop, the financial folders in a slightly different arrangement than I usually kept them. I turned it over a few times that evening, then placed it under the general heading of an innocent explanation and left it there. I am not proud of that choice. But I made it, and I made it deliberately, and the reason I made it was that following the unease to its logical conclusion would have cost me something I was not ready to give up. November came, and my recovery continued well by every clinical measure. My morning walks had extended from 15 minutes back to 45. My appetite was better. My blood pressure was holding at levels that satisfied my cardiologist. I felt more like myself than I had since before the heart attack, and in a different way more open, less defended, less managed. I had nearly died. That had rearranged certain priorities in ways that I could not fully articulate but could feel. Melissa was woven into the fabric of my days in Quezon City in a way that had happened gradually enough that I hadn't marked the individual steps. She knew my medications and the schedule for each. She knew I called Patrick every second Sunday. She knew the 4-digit PIN for the package room in my building's lobby because she had picked up deliveries for me during my recovery. She knew the names of the people in my book group, the general shape of my finances, the specific things that frightened me about what the heart attack might mean for my future. She knew where I kept my passwords. In late October, during a conversation about my recovery and practical arrangements, she had asked calmly, helpfully, framed entirely as a caregiver's practical concern, whether I kept any record of my important passwords somewhere accessible, in case something happened again and someone needed to manage things on my behalf. It was a reasonable question, the kind that a responsible person helping an elderly man through recovery might genuinely ask. I told her yes, a small notebook in the top right drawer of my study desk. She had nodded, said that was sensible, and moved the conversation forward. I need to tell you now what I only learned later, because you deserve to understand the full shape of what happened, even though I was given it in pieces over weeks of investigation and disclosure that were their own particular kind of ordeal. Melissa Navarro was not a nurse at the hospital where I was treated. She was a ward administrative assistant, a non-clinical staff member who handled patient intake and billing paperwork in the admissions unit. She had regular access to patient records, including insurance information, next of kin contacts, and the preliminary financial documentation collected during admission for billing and insurance verification purposes. On the second day of my hospitalization, when I was still not fully coherent and barely able to sit upright, a staff member had come to my bedside to collect information for my admission file. I had answered the questions. I had signed documents I did not read carefully because my hands were shaking and the cardiologist had just finished explaining to me the severity of what had happened to my heart. That staff member was Melissa. She had, on my admission form, the name of my primary U.S. bank. She had my home address in Boston and in Quezon City. She had Patrick's name and contact information. She had enough of a financial outline to identify me as a target worth pursuing. What followed the home visits, the months of care, the relationship was not random kindness that later curdled. She had identified me from my paperwork while I was lying in the cardiac ward, constructed a point of entry through the nursing staff's informal visiting practices, and spent 3 months building the access she needed while I was building what I believed was something real. The home visits were real in the sense that they happened. The care was real in the sense that she showed up and cooked food and took my blood pressure and sat with me through the difficult first weeks of recovery. But they were also reconnaissance. Every conversation about my finances, every question I answered freely because I trusted her. Every visit to my apartment, all of it was moving toward a specific purpose I was not watching for because I was watching for something else entirely. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning in early December. I did a routine check of my primary savings account, something I did every week, had done for years. When the page loaded and the balance appeared, I sat looking at it for a long time. Not because the number was confusing, because my brain refused, for almost a full minute, to accept that it was real. The account had been drawn down by $310,000 across 3 separate wire transfers over the preceding 9 days. The transfers had gone to a receiving account at a Philippine bank. The name authorized on each transfer confirmation was mine. My hands on the keyboard were very still. My chest was calm, which was its own specific horror. The fact that my body could hold something this large without physical response after what it had already been through. I checked my second savings account. 1 transfer, $175,000. 4 days earlier, same receiving account, total, $485,000 gone. I called my U.S. bank immediately. The representative confirmed the transfers, all 6 of them across both accounts had been authorized through my online banking portal, logged in using my credentials, originating from an IP address I did not recognize. When I told her I had not authorized any of them and that my accounts had been accessed fraudulently, she began the dispute process and froze both accounts within minutes. Then I sat in my apartment in the December morning, the city going about its business outside my window, and I began to understand. My laptop in the desk drawer, my financial folders, the password notebook in the top right drawer of the study, the one I had told her about in October. She had had a key to my apartment. She had used it, at some point when I was not there, to access that notebook, log into my accounts from a device she controlled, and execute 6 wire transfers over 9 days, while I had no reason to check my balances more frequently than my normal weekly schedule. She had done this while I was 2 years out from a heart attack that had nearly killed me, while I was taking 4 cardiac medications every morning, while I was the person she had cooked dinner for the previous Sunday. I called Ben first. I'm not entirely sure why, perhaps because he had said what I hadn't wanted to hear, and some part of me needed to start with the person who had already been right. He answered on the second ring. She's taken money, I said. A short silence. How much? $485,000. Where are you right now? My apartment. Don't call her. Don't contact anyone yet. I'm coming up tonight. Do you have a number for the NBI? No. I'll have it when I get there. Jeff, are you physically all right? Your heart? I'm physically fine, I said. I'm fine. That wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough to say out loud. Ben arrived that evening. He had the practical composure of a man who has managed difficult situations before and knows that the first requirement is order rather than emotion. We went through the process together, a call to the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation to file a formal complaint, a call to the receiving Philippine bank to report the fraudulent transfers and request a freeze on the destination account, a call to the American Embassy's Citizen Services line for guidance on the formal steps available to an American national who had been the victim of financial fraud in the Philippines. I had printed everything I could, accessed the transfer records, the transaction logs with timestamps, the wire authorization confirmations, the hospital admission documents from my hospitalization. The next morning I met with a bank investigator named Victor, a careful and methodical man who went through everything I had brought him without visible reaction, making notes in precise handwriting. When he reached the hospital admission document and saw the preliminary financial information it contained, he paused. This form was completed during your hospital admission? He said. Yes. A staff member came to my bedside on the second day. I was told it was for billing and insurance processing. Do you know what her role at the hospital was? She said she was a nurse. Victor set the document down and looked at me carefully. Mr. Ashton, patient admission and billing paperwork is handled by administrative staff, not nursing staff. A nurse would not typically be assigned to collect this information. I heard that land. I heard it clearly. If someone introduced themselves to you as a nurse during this process, he continued, that would be consistent with a deliberate misrepresentation of their role and of the purpose of that initial contact. He explained what his investigation would involve: tracing the receiving account, working with the Philippine Bank's fraud unit, coordinating with the NBI on the criminal complaint. He was honest about timelines and about the difficulty of fund recovery once money had been dispersed across multiple accounts. He said he would update me as things developed. I thanked him and walked out into the December afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment with no particular thought in my head, just the heat and the noise of the street and the full weight of what I now knew. She had not been a nurse. She had come to my bedside in the cardiac ward not because she was assigned to care for me, but because she worked in the admissions unit and had access to my intake paperwork. She had seen my bank information. She had decided I was a viable target. She had introduced herself as a nurse because a nurse at the bedside of a frightened elderly man recovering from a heart attack was a person with immediate, unquestioned trust. Everything had begun with that introduction. Every month that followed had been built on the foundation of that lie. Ben stayed with me for 4 days. He helped with the documentation, sat through the investigative interviews with me, made sure I was eating properly and monitoring my blood pressure the way the cardiology team had instructed. On the third evening, we sat on my balcony, the same balcony where Melissa and I had drunk coffee in the mornings, where she had told me she thought about me when she wasn't there and were quiet for a long time. In September, I said, when you asked me what I actually knew about her. Don't do that to yourself, Ben said. I want to say it plainly. Jeff, even if you'd been more careful, even if you'd looked her up and verified everything, she had your admission document from the day you were hospitalized. She had your bank information before you ever made a single choice about her. The entry point was the hospital, not anything that came after. I gave her the password notebook, I said. I told her exactly where it was. That was my choice. You told a woman you had been close to for 3 months, who had been caring for you through a serious illness, where you kept important documents. That's what people do in close relationships, Jeff. That is not recklessness. He paused, She engineered the entire thing from the beginning. That's not your failure. That is her crime. I heard him. I believed him in the substantial sense, but I also understood that believing him completely would require me to set down a weight I wasn't quite ready to set down yet. The accounting was still running inside me, the inventory of moments where I could have looked more closely and chose not to. The pen holder in the kitchen, the question about the password notebook, Ben's questions in September. Each had been a door I declined to open, and the reason was always the same, because opening it would have cost me something I didn't want to lose. I called Patrick that night. He had known about the heart attack. He had visited. He did not know the full story of Melissa. I had mentioned her in passing, described her as a friend who helped during recovery, never in terms that communicated what she had actually become to me, partly because I thought it was private, partly because some part of me knew that being fully honest about it would produce exactly the conversation I'd already had with Ben, and I hadn't been ready to have it with my son. He was quiet for a long time after I finished telling him everything. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry. The legal process is underway. Victor is handling things carefully. I'm not just talking about the money." Another pause. "I'm sorry you were alone through all of it. The heart attack and what came after. I should have stayed longer. I should have come back. You couldn't have known." "No, but I should have come back anyway. Not because of her, just because you're my father, and you just had a heart attack, and you were 12,000 miles away by yourself." We talked for over an hour. It was the most honest conversation we had managed in years about the gap between us and how it had grown, one reasonable excuse at a time, until it had become a habit that neither of us had chosen deliberately, about the fact that we were both waiting for the other one to close it, which meant neither of us was doing it, about what his life actually looked like on the inside, which I had never asked about with enough patience to hear the full answer. He booked a flight before we hung up. He came not primarily to help with the investigation. Ben had most of that in hand, but to be there. He stayed for 2 weeks. We went out every day. To markets, to the park near my apartment where old men played cards under the trees in the mornings, to restaurants I had been going to alone for 2 years. I introduced him to the people who knew my face, and he was easy and warm with them in a way that made me realize he had, without my noticing, grown into a very decent man. Victor called me 3 weeks after the complaint was filed. "Mr. Ashton, I want to be straightforward with you about where things stand." His voice was measured in the particular way of someone delivering difficult information with care. "We have identified the originating account and have partial information on the individual. The name on the account does not match the name you provided. We believe Melissa Navarro is not her real name." He paused. "The funds were dispersed across multiple secondary accounts within 48 hours of each transfer. Direct recovery at this stage is very unlikely. The investigation will remain open, and we will update you as developments occur, but I don't want you making plans that depend on that money coming back." "I understand," I said. "I'm sorry to give you that assessment. I appreciate your honesty." I sat at the kitchen table after the call. $485,000. Not as an abstraction, as a sum with specific meaning. The difference between a retirement with ease and one that required careful management of every month, the difference between choices and the absence of them. My financial advisor in Boston, a careful man named Frank who had managed my retirement portfolio for 12 years, absorbed the news with professional steadiness. We went through the numbers honestly. My pension was intact. My Social Security was intact. My remaining savings, combined with those 2 income sources, left me with a sustainable monthly income if I was thoughtful. My life in Quezon City was modest enough that sustainable was achievable. Achievable differently than before, with less margin, but achievable. Frank asked about civil litigation. I told him I had spoken with an attorney in Manila who had advised that pursuing civil recovery against an unidentified defendant with dispersed funds was unlikely to produce results proportional to the time and cost involved. "So you're accepting the loss," Frank said. "I'm accepting the loss," I said. A pause. "That takes something, Jeff." "It's the true thing," I said. "Everything else just delays it." I went back to my Wednesday book group in January, 4 months away, and the small table in that coffee shop and the 6 people around it had continued turning without me, as worlds do. The coordinator, a Filipina woman named Corazon who was in her 50s and had run the group since before I joined it, had sent me a message during my hospital stay that I had never properly answered. She didn't mention it when I walked in. She just handed me a cup of tea and asked what I had been reading. A great deal about cardiac care, I said, and some things about financial fraud. She laughed, a clear, real laugh. Well, she said, at least the fraud was educational. I laughed too. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in months, and it surprised me with how much relief was in it. Ben came up from Cebu once a month through that spring. We fell into a comfortable rhythm of dinners and long walks and the kind of conversation that ranged across topics without needing to reach conclusions. One evening in March, sitting at a restaurant I had been going to for 2 years, he asked me whether I was angry. Not in the way you might expect, I said. What way then? I thought about how to say it accurately. The timing of it, I said. The fact that the mechanism was the medical crisis. That she chose to execute it while I was in a hospital bed, specifically because I was in a hospital bed and couldn't monitor my finances. That she came to me when I was most afraid and most open and used that. I paused. That part I feel something cold about. Not hot anger, cold. And toward her as a person? Less than you'd think. Spending energy hating someone I can't find, who is probably not even using the name I knew her by. That energy has to come from somewhere, and I need it for other things. Ben was quiet for a moment. I think that's the right way to be, he said, though I'm not sure I could manage it. It just takes a while to get there, I said. Patrick came back in April, as he had promised. He had made it a standing arrangement every 4 months, a trip to the Philippines, no special occasion required. The first time he proposed this, I had not entirely believed he meant it. In April, he was there, with a bag and 3 questions he had been saving up from conversations we had started in December and not finished. We drove out to Tagaytay one afternoon, the volcano caldera, the lake far below, the mist coming off the water. I had been there once before, in my first months in the city, and had stood at the rim and felt small in a way that was briefly comforting. Standing there with Patrick beside me, talking about nothing in particular, I felt something different. Not small, just located, like I knew exactly where I was. On the drive back, he asked, "Are you going to stay? In the Philippines?" I had been asking myself that question since December. "Yes," I said, "I think so. Even after everything." "The city didn't do this," I said. "One person did, and the city also gave me misses. Pacampara and Rolly and Ben and Victor and the book group and the cardiology team that kept me alive. I watched the road ahead of us. I'm not going to let what one person did erase what's real here." He was quiet for a few minutes. Then he said, "Okay, then I'll keep coming. You don't have to." "I want to," he said. "That's the difference." He glanced over at me. "I've been operating like it's an obligation for too many years, Dad. It isn't. I just forgot that for a while." I turned 73 in April, Patrick called, which he always had. But this year he also sent a package, a small collection of books I had mentioned over the months since his last visit, and a photograph, printed and framed, of the 2 of us taken in the hospital on the day he arrived after my heart attack. I looked terrible in it, pale and diminished, sitting up in the bed with monitors visible behind me. He looked frightened in the specific way that children look when a parent's mortality becomes suddenly concrete. But we were both looking at the camera and both almost smiling, and it was real in a way that a lot of more composed photographs are not. I put it on the shelf above my desk, in the study where Melissa had once stood, in front of my closed laptop, looking, she said, for a pen. I don't think about her every day anymore. For the first 2 months after discovery, she was present in my mind almost constantly, that particular relentless replaying of a thing that refuses to fully resolve. Recalibrating moments. Working backward through the months of care and warmth, trying to locate where the performance was visible, trying to understand how much of it had been constructed and how much, if any, had been real on her side in some human sense. Whether the mornings on the balcony with coffee had been entirely calculated or whether something human had complicated the transaction somewhere in those months, I don't know the answer, and I have accepted that I am not going to know it. I only have access to my side of it, and on my side, what I felt was genuine. The gratitude that became trust, that became something I would have called love if I had been willing to use the word, that was real. What she did with it was the crime, not what I felt. There are specific practical failures I own without excuse. I should not have told her where I kept my passwords, regardless of how natural the conversation felt. I should have changed my banking credentials when I saw her at my desk in October and felt the unease I felt and chose to set aside. Those were real failures of judgment, and they contributed to what happened. I own them. But the larger motion, the choice to be open after years of careful distance, to let someone matter to me, that was not a mistake. That was a person trying to live more honestly than he had been living, in the time remaining to him. The heart attack had done something to me that I had not expected. It had made the managed distance of my previous life look like what it was, a different kind of loss, slower and quieter and easier to confuse with dignity. I came out of that hospital bed more open than I went in. She exploited that opening, but the opening itself was the right thing. What I know now that I didn't know when I arrived in Quezon City is that vulnerability is not something you can put away when you're done with it. I had kept myself very managed for the years after my divorce, efficient, self-sufficient, at a careful remove from the kind of need that might embarrass me. The heart attack knocked that down completely, and Melissa found me in the rubble. I don't regret that she found me open. I regret that she used it the way she did. But the openness itself, the willingness to need someone, to be cared for, to let another person into the specific details of your daily life, I don't think that was a mistake. I think it is the right way to be in the world, even when it costs you, even when the cost is $485,000 and a specific quality of faith that has to be rebuilt from scratch. I am 73 years old. My heart works adequately with the assistance of 4 medications I take each morning. My savings are reduced in ways that are real and permanent and that I have made my peace with in the incremental, undramatic way that actual peace arrives not as a single resolved moment but as a daily loosening. My son comes to the Philippines every 4 months, and he means it. My Wednesday book group is in the middle of a heated disagreement about a history book that Corazon selected and that half of us find essential and half of us find maddening. Rolly waves at me from the lobby. Mrs. Pacampra and I exchange pleasantries in the hall. Every morning I make coffee. I bought a different maker after the heart attack, smaller, quieter, a different model. When I use it, I am briefly aware of the morning the other one came off the counter, of the floor coming up to meet me, of everything that followed. The awareness passes. The coffee is good. I have not given anyone a key to my apartment. I may not for a long time, and that caution is both wisdom and scar tissue, and I have decided not to spend energy trying to determine which part is which. The door stays mine for now. When the time comes to share it again, and I don't rule out that the time will come, I will share it with more care, more verification, and the particular alertness of a man who has learned, at significant cost, the difference between feeling known and actually being known. But I will share it. I am certain of that. $485,000 is a devastating sum to lose. I will not minimize it. It changed the shape of my remaining years in concrete ways. It cost me options I had expected to have. It is not a small thing, and I will not perform acceptance of it as though it were. But I am still here, in a city I love, in an apartment above a lobby, where a young man named Rolly waves at me every morning like I belong here. I do belong here. That part, at least, she did not take. There is a thing I have been trying to find the right words for since December, and I want to try to say it here because I think it is the most important thing, more important even than the money or the investigation or the specific mechanics of how she did what she did. When I lay on that kitchen floor waiting for help that I could not call for myself, I was more afraid than I have ever been in my life. More afraid than any board meeting, any failed deal, any professional setback. More afraid than the night Carol told me the marriage was finished. more afraid than the months after she left, when the apartment was quiet in a way that had nothing restful in it. That was a different kind of fear, the fear of a man who has organized his life around capability and competence suddenly encountering the absolute limit of both. My heart, which I had never thought about, which I had simply relied on the way you rely on a foundation, had without warning decided to demonstrate its own fragility. And I was on the floor and I could not do a single thing about it. That fear changed me. It changed me in the hospital and it changed me in the weeks of recovery afterward. It stripped something away, some layer of self-sufficiency that I had mistaken for strength, but that was, I understand now, partly a way of not having to need anything from anyone. When you have spent 35 years being the person who manages situations rather than the person who requires managing, the habit of self-containment becomes invisible to you. It just feels like who you are. It takes lying on a floor with your heart misbehaving to show you that it was a choice all along, and that the choice had costs you hadn't been counting. What I found in the hospital, in Melissa's presence before I knew anything else about her, was the specific relief of being cared for without having to justify the need for it. She did not wait for me to demonstrate competence before she helped me. She did not require me to manage the situation or present well or be anything other than what I was, which was a frightened old man who had just had a heart attack. She simply helped. And that simple act of unguarded care, even though it was, I now know, the opening move of a carefully designed deception, was something I had been starving for long before she appeared. That is the uncomfortable truth. The vulnerability she exploited was real, and it was genuine, and it was mine, and it had been building for years. The divorce, the distance from Patrick, the retirement that felt more like absence than arrival, the Boston apartment with its particular quality of quiet that I have already described and that I do not need to describe again, all of it had been accumulating. All of it had been creating the precise conditions in which a kind face at a hospital bedside could become, in a matter of months, the most important relationship in my daily life. I am not saying this to excuse her or to redirect blame from her to myself. What she did was calculated and it was cruel in its specific timing, and I do not minimize that. I am saying it because I think the most important thing to understand, not just for me, but for any man who reads this or hears this and recognizes something in it, is that the wound she went into was not created by her. It was already there. She found it and she used it. But it was mine. And the work of healing from what happened is not only the work of recovering from her, it is the work of recovering from the thing that made me so available to her in the first place. That work is slower. It has no legal filing, no investigative report, no settlement figure. It is just the daily effort of being honest about what I need and seeking it in ways that do not require me to pretend I am not seeking it. Of calling Patrick not just on scheduled Sundays, but on a Thursday because I want to talk. Of telling Ben that his company on those monthly visits means more to me than I usually say out loud. Of sitting in the Wednesday book group and letting myself be part of something rather than simply a body present in a room. Of understanding that being cared for is not a weakness, that needing other people is not a character flaw that a competent man should have outgrown, that the armor I spent decades polishing was protecting me from some things and costing me others, and that the trade was less favorable than I had been telling myself. Rowley asked me once, in the weeks after everything came out, whether I was doing all right. He asked it in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who is genuinely asking rather than making conversation. He is 26 years old and he works a lobby desk, and he watched the ambulance come for me on the morning of the heart attack, and he has greeted me every single day since with the same cheerful wave, and on this one occasion he stopped the wave and asked, with his full attention, whether I was doing all right. I told him I was getting there. He nodded and said good, and then the wave came back, and that was all. It was a small thing. I thought about it for the rest of that day. A 26-year-old security guard who had known me for 2 years, asking a genuine question and receiving a genuine answer and leaving it at that, no advice, no follow-up concern, no performance of care that expected something in return. Just the question, the answer, and then the ordinary resumption of the day. That is what genuine care looks like. It does not ask for anything back. It does not build toward something. It does not require you to have been chosen for a reason. I had forgotten the difference between that and what Melissa was doing. I had felt the attention and the warmth and the specific quality of being attended to, and I had called it care without stopping to verify it. The verification would have been uncomfortable. It would have broken the feeling, and I had wanted the feeling enough to skip the verification. That is the lesson I carry. Not be suspicious of everyone. Not the warmth of people in this country is not real. Not a man of my age has no business opening himself to connection. None of those things are the lesson. The lesson is specifically this: warmth can be genuine and it can be manufactured, and the way you tell the difference is not by feeling it but by testing it gently, over time, through the small accumulated evidence of whether what a person says and does and is actually holds together, through asking Ben's questions rather than resenting them, through taking the discomfort of a small doubt seriously instead of burying it under the weight of what you want to be true. The heart attack took something from me and gave me something back. What it took was the illusion that I was separate from the ordinary human need for care and company and genuine closeness. What it gave back was the actual experience of needing those things and receiving them, even if the receiving, in Melissa's case, turned out to be constructed rather than real. The experience of being open, of having the armor off, of sitting on a balcony with morning coffee and feeling like the day ahead was something more than a schedule to move through that was real on my side. That happened. She used it, but it happened. And I will not trade that back. I will not close myself back down to the managed, careful, self-sufficient distance I kept for 11 years in Boston and call it safety. It was safety from the specific kind of hurt that came from Melissa. It was not safety from the slower, quieter hurt of living at arm's length from your own life. I would rather be Geoffrey Ashton, who sat on a balcony in Quezon City and felt something, than Geoffrey Ashton, who adjusted the thermostat in his Boston apartment and called the quiet peace. The $485,000 is gone. The woman who took it is, in all practical senses, gone. The investigation is open and likely to remain that way for a very long time. What is not gone is what I found here: the city, the book group, the people who waved and helped and asked genuine questions, and the son who flies 12,000 miles every 4 months because he wants to, not because he has to. I am still here. That is, in the end, the only accounting that matters.